Welcome, welcome. I'm Jonathan Friedman, and this is The Common Room, PEN America's conversation series about free speech, diversity, and inclusion in higher education. PEN America's mission is to celebrate creative expression and to defend the civil liberties that make it possible. And I invite all of you in attendance today to consider joining our national membership of writers, journalists, scholars, and their allies in support of our mission. Today, we'll be tackling a pressing issue in higher education following a spate of controversial cases where issues of academic freedom for faculty have been pitched against the rights of students to be protected from abuse or harm and generally go to school in inclusive classrooms. I'm delighted to be joined for this very important topic by three experts. First, Neijma Celestine-Donnor, Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Celestine-Donnor leads efforts to respond to hate and bias through trauma-focused response and support, training, education, data collection, and distribution. Neijma, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Second, we're delighted to be joined by Amna Khalid, an associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, specializing in modern South Asian history and the history of medicine. This year, Amna is serving as the inaugural John Stuart Mill Faculty Fellow at Heterodox Academy. Welcome, Amna.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And third, John K. Wilson, contributing editor of Academe blog of the American Association of University Professors, who was also a 2019-20 fellow at the University of California's National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. John is the author of 8 books, including The Myth of Political Correctness, The Conservative Attack on Higher Education. John, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
All right, so before we get into the main topic of the hour today, just wanted to quickly remind everyone that this is a forum for interaction and open dialogue. So I ask everyone participating to speak to one another with respect, and of course to remember to mute when not speaking. We'll be reserving time for questions in the second half of the program, but audience members are invited to submit comments or questions in the chat or the Q&A throughout. So to the topic of today, I thought we would just get right into it with generally a framing question, which I think is important to bear in mind when talking about college classrooms and higher education generally. The question is, what makes a college classroom environment so unique, a setting for conversation, dialogue, and debate unlike any other? John, why don't you take it first?
Well, I think what makes colleges unusual is that they have this atmosphere of intellectual freedom, and that's part of what it means. That for professors, freedom in the classroom means they have the freedom to express their ideas, to guide the class, to assign this, to create the syllabus and how the class is run, and to say what they wish to during the class. And that way, higher education in some ways is very different from K through 12 education, where you have a lot more regulation about what books are supposed to be read, how teachers are supposed to teach. And so the idea in higher education is that academic freedom, that freedom of the professor within the classroom makes for a higher quality education, that having that liberty allows for professors to explore new boundaries and to express ideas.
Amna, how does that sound to you, that definition?
I think I completely agree with what John said. And, to me, as someone who's in the classroom all the time teaching, it's a space where people are coming together to genuinely learn. And I think it's a place where we can go down different kinds of lines of inquiry and just see where they take us. So without predetermining what's going to happen. And for me, it is a testing ground where we explore ideas together. So it's not necessarily a place where a professor is professing in that they're giving knowledge to students, but a place where we have discussion and explore things together. And it is an experimental ground. So as much as the academic freedom of the professor is important, it is also something that I think is important for students, for them to be able to test out ideas and positions without thinking that there are going to be consequences.
A testing ground, exploration, a place for intellectual freedom and exploring new ideas. Neijma, when you think about college classrooms, is this what you think makes them unique too?
Yes, I would say that. And what I really appreciate about the classroom setting is unlike, I don't want to say adults, but unlike folks that are not in the classroom, students are not necessarily stuck in their ways or their opinion and ways of thinking. And so there's a level of openness that I experience where there is much more of a willingness to listen and learn and understand. And I think that allows for a lot of fruitful conversation, dialogue, and debate that doesn't necessarily take place outside of the classroom.
So a unique space for people to be listening to one another, for young people. I mean, what responsibilities then do you think are on the professor to create that climate, Neijma?
So, I mean, I think that professors should be able to introduce new ways of thinking. I think that they should be able to create an environment that really allows for academic debate and discussion. But I also think that it's the responsibility of professors to be really in tune with power, privilege, and racial trauma. If we're not paying attention to those things, then I think sometimes we can cause some harm even in our attempt to have some of these intellectual debates and conversation. So I think the responsibility is twofold.
Amna, how do you respond to that? You know, thinking about this question, there's been a lot of national debate around the question of whether students' sense of harm should be used to evaluate where the bounds are for what professors can teach, you know, what they can explore, to reference what you were talking about before.
Yeah, I want to, in part, echo what Neijma said, in that, we talk about intellectual freedom and academic freedom, and that's our right, indeed. And I agree that there is a responsibility that the professor has to create an environment that kind of fosters that kind of open inquiry. However, where I distinguish or would part ways with maybe perhaps what Neijma said is that, I'm wary of the language of harm and trauma becoming the touchstone to determine what the limits of conversation in classrooms should be. I think it should always be respectful, but these are very capacious terms, and the offense is again another big term where people can be offended by anything. I sometimes get offended when my children chew with their mouths open, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I should not be able to say something, or that they shouldn't be able to say something. So I would caution us, for me at least, to think very carefully about how we're defining this, because there's a way in which these ideas can encroach on academic freedom, and not just that of the professor. That's again something I want to emphasize, but also that of fellow students, who want to say things and test things out, but we're inhibiting them.
John, what do you think of this tension?
Well, I think it's important for professors in some cases to challenge students as well as to respect them. And that's particularly true when you talk about issues of power and privilege. We just experienced a Trump administration that tried to ban discussions of critical race theory and was clearly offended by the idea of talking about racism and white privilege. And I think sometimes professors should have to offend conservative students who may be offended by discussions about privilege and power, just as they may need to offend leftist students who are offended by certain ideas. And so it's important for me for professors to have that sense of responsibility and respect for students, but it's also important for them to have the freedom that responsibility is a moral responsibility and not something that's imposed upon them, that there are banned ideas that they're not allowed to talk about, that instead we have a broader discussion about what is the proper way, the best ways for faculty to teach and to respect their students.
Yeah, John, you previously told me that you think of yourself as having a really high bar for faculty autonomy. What has influenced that sense? Just if you were to reflect on, I know over a decade, even longer, I think of monitoring and tracking different cases where different people have expressed outrage at things professors have said. Why do you want to keep the bar high?
Well, part of it is a distrust of the people who would regulate those kind of ideas, because if it's not the professor who's going to be, in a sense, in charge of the classroom and given the freedom to speak, then who do we trust to be given that power? Do we trust the legislators or the trustees or the top administrators to decide what discussions about race are going to be allowed in the classroom, what kind of ideas are going to be permitted. So there is certainly a lack of trust and authority that's involved in that. And I think there's also a long experience of, in some ways, an overreaction to what a professor might tweet or to some idea taken out of context. I think context is really important for how professors teach, and when there's one word or one phrase that maybe gets posted online somewhere of what a professor has said that's offended somebody, I think that really takes away from what is a really in-depth relationship between professors and students. And I think often we underestimate what our students are capable of absorbing and dealing with and challenging.
I mean, do you see that as the issue, Neijma? I know John, you're saying let's be distrustful of empowering maybe administrators or other people and how they might use the power of punishing professors. But isn't it the case that professors then instead are given, a great deal of power over their students to kind of make these decisions for them? Neijma, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that. And I think I noticed that, my colleagues here are using offended a lot. And I would just caution on that because I think people don't understand that it's really just more than being offended. As someone who is a psychotherapist who's on the receiving end, having to see all those children, I can tell you, sorry, students, young adults, it's not just being offended, right? It's really some deep-seated trauma that we're causing. And I do not use that word lightly because I am a trauma clinician. And so I do think that there has to be a balancing act between being able to say, yes, let's have this discussion, but also we have to know that there is not offense, there is actual harm that's being caused. It's not being just offended by a casual comment. And to the point that John was saying, like, yes, students and professors get into really important discussions, but I can tell you as someone who sees students, they cannot engage in discussions when they've been harmed or when they're sitting in a classroom traumatized because a professor said something that really activated something in them. So I think that if our goal is to really have these conversations, we can't really have these conversations when we're causing harm to students and they're just sitting there. So we have to figure out how there needs to be a balance between what we're trying to do, what we're actually doing, and what students are experiencing in the classroom. I don't know if that answered your question, but there goes my
No, I think it's very interesting because often we in the national conversation about these issues, it's like, these stories I think are often presented as, professor this said this comment, and it's kind of assumed that there should be a response to that, right? That there is a kind of clear line around where where offensiveness is, or it's set, or what is beyond the bounds. But often it is somewhat subjective in terms of what you just said. What's activated in the students, right? Like it's not this thing you said to me today isn't just maybe offensive, but it can trigger. I think in your experience, you've seen it trigger long held, deeply felt sentiments sometimes of racism or sexism or marginalization. So I think the question is then, like, how do you train faculty to be, I don't know, is that you said, attuned to that, better attuned to it, better responsible for it? I mean, Amna, do you think that is what faculty need?
So it's a good question, Jonathan, and I'd like to respond to some things that have come up. So Neijma, I completely concur. If a student is truly suffering from trauma or pain, of course, it is our responsibility to make sure that we deliver to them what we're doing in a responsible fashion. However, my worry comes that we're using that, in not you in particular, but that word gets used, even trauma and harm is being used in a very, very loose way these days. And let me come back, and that goes to what John was saying, the key over here is context, right? And what I find in the conversations that are happening and the trends that we're seeing is that the context is totally being erased. And these words that are being used or statements that are being made are being seen without any attention to whether this was someone as a professor, whether they were just articulating a position or whether they were endorsing it. So let me give you an example. As a historian, I deal with primary texts all the time, which are written back in the 19th century when they didn't have our sensibilities of today, and different kinds of words were used. And also we have to understand, this is something I think we're becoming a very literal minded society where we don't appreciate that words change over time and their meaning changes over time. So they meant something very different at that point in time. And some of those words may have been used in morally reprehensible ways in that context as well. I'm not making a case that they weren't problematic even then. Nonetheless, when we need to get into that historical mindset, we have to engage with those texts. And when we're reading those out or when we're talking about them, we're not endorsing them. We are deeply thinking about those things and questions. And I will say over here that if things like that are triggering for a student, the onus is A, on the student to first inform a faculty member that they're going through something. And B, if they're not yet ready to deeply delve into these kinds of conversations, which are at the heart of an educational experience, then perhaps they need to wait and come back a little later when they can meaningfully have these conversations, not because they need to be stronger, just because they need to be in a position that they can truly make the most of that educational experience for themselves.
John, just bringing you in here, what are you thinking about?
Well, I think it's important to try and help students deal with issues of trauma and harm. And I think there is a continuum between what is offensive, what is harmful, what is traumatic. And professors should not be needlessly harming or even offending students. They should be worried about that and concerned about that, and not seeking out to offend or certainly not to cause harm to their students. But I do worry about the danger that professors may start to, censor themselves just because of the speculation they might have in their own minds. Could this possibly cause trauma, or could someone claim to have had a traumatic reaction to what I'm going to say? And then they become afraid to deal with what are really important and traumatic issues in the history of this country and the world, of racism and oppression. These are potentially traumatic things, but they're incredibly important things to talk about. And so we need to figure out ways to help students deal with trauma, not avoid trauma when you're dealing with these kind of harsh and traumatic truths about history.
So I think we would all agree that there are steps then that professors can take, framing steps, comments on syllabi, the way that you prepare for difficult conversations or to teach difficult texts, as you mentioned, Amna. But I guess the question that we're seem to not have much agreement on is then what happens when the hot moment arrives. So one student, a group of students is offended, upset, traumatized, triggered. I mean, there could be a range of responses to something that happens in a classroom. What happens when they start to tell people about it, whether they tell the professor first, whether they bring it to an office like yours, Neijma, or whether they kind of make a public demand of some kind that something should happen? How do those who have to kind of evaluate the situation, evaluate what was said? I mean, there's a set of them where we have video, and sometimes that helps, but not always to get the full context. In other cases, we don't have video. There's just kind of like competing testimonies. The professor feels that they said this, the students heard that the professor said something different and something else was intimated. So, who do we trust here to kind of decide what should be done? And I think we've seen, all kinds of responses, from professors being suspended, pulled from classrooms, put on leave, fired over sometimes really what are in time relatively short bursts of speech. So I'm just curious for you to have your thoughts about like what kind of processes can be put in place to mediate these conflicts when they arise. We'll start with you, Neijma.
Yeah. So I think for me, it is always a process that centers those who have been impacted. I think the ways in which we respond right now, not only are they punitive, but they're also centered on the professor. what are we going to do to them or him or her? What are we going to do to make sure they're being punished? And oftentimes it's to the detriment of the students who have been harmed. And what I mean by that is we focus all our time, energy, and resources on punishing a professor. And meanwhile, we have a student who has been harmed who is not giving any time or attention. And so for me, it's really important that we keep in mind that, and I say this over, and I know, John, you've heard me say this, punishment does not equal healing. So you could punish a professor all day long, fire them, take them out of the classroom, but what does that do for the student who has been harmed? And so from a trauma centered perspective, the ways in which we have to respond needs to center those who've been harmed. We can also be thinking about ways in which we can address what has happened to the professor. But if we're responding to the professor and we're not responding to the student, then we're really doing our students a disservice. So the way that we operate at our institutions and the way that I have always operated in this role is, what can I do to center this student to make sure they're okay? And oftentimes that is not necessarily being punitive to the professor, because again, my perspective is supporting, right? And sometimes that leads to having a restorative conversation between the professor and the student to say, these are the ways in which I've been harmed. How can we move forward in a restorative approach? Now, there are some professors that I believe that have done really, really horrible things and have said horrible things that I do think should be fired. It's probably not the majority, but have done really, really harmful things. But I do think for me, the majority of times we are punitive to the detriment of the students, and we don't have to go down that route.
So Amna, same set of questions. What kind of processes to you are necessary to be putting in place?
The first thing I'd say is, before we get into thinking about processes that are putting in place, yes, there are those few professors who have said horrible things with the intention of saying them and have harmed students. And those should be, I would never make a case for them to not be taken to task for that, right? But right now, I think our conversation is about this trend that is taking place, where increasingly there is a tendency there are a couple of things over here. One, that the students don't approach the professor directly and go to either an administrator or to social media. Now there, I think we are doing a disservice to our students by not teaching them how to bring a problem to your own professor. That should be the first port of call. Go and tell them. And most often, I think a lot of these disagreements or offense or harm situations can be dealt with by saying, hey, I don't agree with this, or I was hurt by this. Why did you say this? And they could explain and say, well, actually, I didn't mean it that way. And it's a clarification question and the conversation can move on. Yet I feel sometimes people are getting so wedded to the idea of punishment as a form of social justice that it's being used in that fashion. So that's something that I worry about. The other thing I worry about in these contexts is we are teaching our students that there is a very flat understanding of power if we think that the only power in a classroom is that the professor holds. Power is a very complex thing. In fact, I would argue these days it's a small minority of people on campuses who speak very loudly, who are not necessarily in authority positions, who are wielding the power. And we have seen how that has been wielded in this past year and the consequences of that power. So I'd like to complicate this notion of power as being only or as only residing in figures of authority. Students have a lot of power. And if we can begin to recognize this, I think we can all have far more productive conversations that are truly educational, as opposed to getting hemmed into these ways of thinking about, what is harmful or not harmful.
So it sounds like you're talking about, calling in rather than calling out, as they say. But what I didn't hear, though, and I'm curious to push you a little bit further on this, is so you call in the professor. You say, dear professor, what you said today was really offensive to me. And then the professor, let's say, finds it absurd, that anyone took offense at anything they said. They can't imagine how a lecture they've been giving for a long time. I mean, I'm just kind of conjuring one scenario here, but they've been giving lecture a long time, and they can't imagine why a student got offended. Where is the student to go with that next? I mean, I know there are cases where that calling in hasn't happened first, but there are also ones where those kinds of attempts haven't really resulted in much change, leaving people frustrated.
So I'm glad you asked that, actually, because frankly, I think most responsible professors, and I would say the majority would take that as an opportunity to have a conversation. Why were you offended? Oh, that's interesting, because I've taught this for a long time. Let's explore this. And I've had students who've come to me and talked about this. And I'm like, okay, let's think about it and let's get to the root of it. And then I'll explain what my intention is and what the pedagogical purpose is of using this in a particular way. And I clarify, this was not meant to hurt you, but there is a bigger thing that we're exploring over here. And in some of those conversations, I have had students who are genuinely traumatized because of a history of trauma. And in that case, I've helped them try and get the help that is necessary for them to responsibly engage with this material such that they can learn and not shut down because of the trauma. In the event, in those rare cases, I think, where a student, it would be very unbecoming of a professor to be flip about it and say, well, this is absurd, I don't know why you're offended. I think that's an opportunity, an educational and teaching opportunity that a professor should embrace and dig into. But in those rare cases, I still think if it doesn't rise to the level of harassment and discrimination, really it is an issue for the student and the professor to resolve in some way, shape, or form. Because when we send our students out into the broader world, we need to equip them to have those difficult conversations. They won't have someone else to run to complain about it. This is about becoming adults and learning how to engage in sustained difficult conversations. Things don't get resolved instantaneously. And in this particular moment in the US, where we're having a moment of racial reckoning, we need to be prepared, both as professors and students, to have sustained difficult conversations. There is no quick fix over here.
John, your thoughts on some of these matters?
I think I disagree with that sort of analysis of power, because I think professors have an enormous amount of power over students, and students are quite powerless. And so I think we need to give students and protect students, give students the freedom to criticize their professors in class, outside of class, to administrators. They should have the right to go public and denounce their professors and demand their firing. That's a right they have. It's not ideally how I want to see this situation resolved. I would love to see professors be the support systems for students, but I think we need to provide for the fact that students are not always going to be comfortable to go directly to their professors and say, you harmed me. We need to have other people they can go to, support systems, whether it's students, ombudspersons, administrators, others who can help them ideally go to their professors and have a conversation, but in cases where they don't do that, to try and help them deal with these kinds of issues. And so I think we need to protect both the right of professors to offend students, but also the right of students to be offended and to speak out and to express that harm and that trauma they've experienced.
John, do you have any ideas about how you think, so let's say that happens, the students go to one of these other bodies on the campus, how do those bodies, how could they, I think you and I follow these things pretty closely, and we've seen just numerous cases where we thought, I'm not sure that the people have made the right decision here, whether it's, pulling a professor or suspending them, etc. Using the kind of measure of how upset or offended a group of students is, or how much attention something is getting on social media as the metric for how much the administrator should take action. Are there any thoughts that you have on how you could insulate those processes from that public reaction or from the students' reaction, or how you could ensure better that there is a kind of fairness or impartiality, if that's even possible, in how we're evaluating that thing that professor said that upset people?
Well, it's obviously difficult under some circumstances to solve all these problems easily. I think there are ways to create structures where you're not punishing professors for causing harm to their students or traumatizing their students in ways that aren't harassment or discrimination. That you can help professors learn better ways to deal with this, that you can help students to deal with this without having to bring in the apparatus of punishment. And so there are ways also to bring it as part of a public conversation. I don't think necessarily all of these public conversations about these issues are a bad thing. I think it is a bad thing when it leads to punishment and silencing of these kinds of things. But I think it is important sometimes to have these difficult conversations and that where students have been harmed, and for students to talk about that and to have ways for universities to deal with that, whether it could even be, some people are very opposed to bias response teams. I'm not necessarily so opposed to that. I think there's an opportunity to have ways for students to go to places to say, to express how they feel, from these people to respond in reasonable ways that are not authoritative and repressive, to help professors maybe better understand how their students feel.
That's certainly been one concern that we've seen it about bias response teams, or just generally the ways in which people have been reacting to a lot of these cases, that there is a kind of chilling effect on professors and the things that the topics they're willing to broach in the class, the ways in which they might, try to push students, even their use of humor and satire. I've been told people are afraid to make jokes because of how jokes might be misinterpreted. Neijma, I'm curious, you talked a little bit before about restorative justice as a better solution, healing better than punishment. I was wondering if you could elaborate maybe on that, or whether you share these concerns about a chilling, as if that's how you perceive it on your campus or others.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we've been kind of saying this, I do think that there is some concern for this chilling effect. And I also think that, again, there's a concern for continuous harm being caused. The reason that I really subscribe and use restorative practices is because I think it's sort of this middle ground where we have an opportunity to really engage in conversations that could promote healing. And this is an opportunity for students to be able to talk to professors about the ways in which they have been harmed. I am very clear that I don't get to define people's harm for them, right? So what might be harmful for them or me, we may not be eye to eye. So I think that's an opportunity for students to really be able to say that, and for professors to be able to hear that. I do not believe in students approaching professors because, one, to John's point, there's a great power dynamic, particularly if you're talking about a white male professor and a Black immigrant student like myself. There's no way that power dynamic is not going to come into play, and I've seen it time and time again. But more importantly, what I see happen is that professors re-traumatize students because it becomes this interrogation of, well, tell me why you're offended. And they just go down this sort of like fact-based and totally miss the mark. And so for me, restorative practices is really an opportunity where you can have a professional who knows what they're doing, who's not going to re-traumatize the student, where both sides get an opportunity to say, this is what I was thinking, this is what I was feeling, and where we're not so stuck on intention and we're really paying attention to impact. I don't think that the bar needs to be discrimination. That is a very, very high bar when we're talking about the legality of things. And if we use that as a benchmark, then a lot of these things will not be addressed. Furthermore, the legality of something has nothing to do with the impact. So even if the professor's action is legal, that does not mean that there's not impact. And so we have to be very careful about the lens that we're using. We can use a legal lens, but we also need to use a trauma-informed, because using the legal lens means that we miss lots of opportunities to address things that we should be addressing.
Amna, do you have any thoughts on this, or you want another question?
Well, I was just going to say, I think there is a fundamental disagreement, and this is wonderful because we need more spaces where we can have these conversations. So I appreciate the opportunity, but I think for me, context and intent is key. It doesn't mean that it absolves you of the responsibility to have a responsible conversation about it, but it also doesn't, it cannot be put out of the picture in conversations about how the matter has to be dealt with. So I think there's some fundamental differences, but I'm happy to go on to your next question.
Sure. I mean, I was just curious, taking the name from the title of the session today about quote unquote classroom conduct. So, and sometimes a distinction being made between free speech and classroom conduct. I saw this recently at Texas A&M, though I've seen it at other places before, which is the justification being given for dismissing or pulling a professor from teaching or suspending them in some way is, well, we had a lot of student complaints. This wasn't just free speech. It wasn't just academic freedom. It wasn't just, one thing said sometime. It was many things said over time, or it's not a matter of free speech. It's a matter of classroom conduct. I'm just wondering, if you think that makes sense. Is that a legitimate distinction being made? Is it concerning to you in some ways? And I guess I was thinking, Amna, if that one was for you first.
Classroom conduct, this is interesting. So of course, if there is a professor and there is a string of incidents, or there is a pattern that is emerging, I think that needs to be addressed. So I would never say that, no, take no measures against that person. It needs to be addressed. But I think the first port of call when something like this happens is for students to approach the professor and try and have a reasonable conversation about it, both sides being reasonable, not just the student. The onus isn't just on them. But it's interesting over here, the number of student complaints in itself cannot be the sole measure, because we have had incidents where students decide that they don't like a professor and they decide that they just want to band together and do that. And I've seen this happen at several institutions. And I'm not saying that's always the case, but again, context is key. That situation has to be analyzed in the context of what is going on. What are the power dynamics? So this is where I would say that power can work in complicated and different kinds of ways than we normally assume. I'm not sure if that's really answering the question, Jonathan, but maybe if you want to clarify more about what you were trying to get at.
Well, I'm just curious, how, I guess it's a question ultimately in my mind, again, of power, the power to say, I was just struck by an administrator saying this isn't free speech, when essentially the incidents or the complaints are about things said and saying, we categorize this somewhat differently, and then kind of how that distinction could be arrived at.
So I want to make a distinction here between free speech and academic freedom. I think there are two things that need to be. So no professor should go into a classroom and egregiously talk about factually incorrect things, for instance. That's not okay, or talk about things in a way that is kind of trying to push a point onto their students. So those are all things I will grant. But academic freedom is a very different thing. It's about responsibly engaging with the material and having the freedom to explore it and ask questions with that responsibility front and center.
It shouldn't push any points on their students. I mean, aren't there some points that professors have an obligation to push on their students? For example, I don't know, let's take like the 2020 election, the notion that Trump may have actually won. I mean, isn't there actually, of course, I agree with you in terms of not lying or kind of, the responsibility to tell the truth, but doesn't with the responsibility to tell the truth come also a responsibility to correct students, misunderstandings or falsehoods?
That's a factual yes, I said you cannot go in and say factually incorrect things. If you are pointing out there are students who believe that Trump won and you have evidence and you can back it, which we do, that in fact that is not the case, that's not an opinion. That is a fact that you are engaging in. So I think there's also, we need to be clear about what evidence is and what an opinion is. What I'm trying to say is that no professor should go in and be like, you all need to be Democrats, or you all need to be Republicans, or something is wrong with being a Republican, or being a Democrat, whatever the case may be. It's more about, pushing that kind of ideology on, as opposed to taking the question and exploring it in light of the evidence we have.
I mean, it's interesting because what about you all, or we all have a responsibility to fight racism, or we all have a responsibility to support human rights around the world? Are there questions where that obligation would supersede those differences?
We have a responsibility, I agree, to fight injustice. But why must we subscribe to only one way of doing it, right? Why can we not explore, as professors, our responsibility is that let's explore what are the various ways. And I have no problems with people presenting, the kinds of approaches that are dominant on campuses today about the notions of justice. But to open up space to say that there are other ways that we can think about these too. This cannot be the sole way that we are allowed to talk about justice and injustice. That is fundamentally anti-viewpoint diversity and anti-open inquiry, which are the hallmarks of what an education ought to be.
John, I'm going to turn to you on this point. Anything to add?
Were you talking to John? Sorry.
Sorry, John, anything to add here?
Yeah, I think that I would disagree with some of what Amna has just said, because I think that's an ideal for what the classroom should be, that professors shouldn't push points, they shouldn't say anything that's inaccurate. All of those things are wonderful, and there should be all this diversity of viewpoints. Yes, that's great. I hope we have that. But classrooms, as they really are often imperfect. The professors are not always doing all of that. And it's important to protect the freedom of professors to do that, to sometimes push a point, to sometimes say things that other people think are factually inaccurate. And we need to be very careful not to fall into the trap of saying, oh, you engaged in indoctrination, therefore you're going to be fired for it, just because you've expressed some strong point of view. And so we need to protect the freedom of professors to make mistakes, to get things wrong, to educate in an imperfect way, even while we try and persuade them to pursue better ways of teaching.
Just to clarify, I wasn't suggesting that we, draw these hard lines. I was sketching the ideal. And I think as a society, I completely concur with you. We need to protect the freedom of professors to make genuine mistakes. And I find we're becoming a very unforgiving society overall. That's one of the questions is there is no room for mistakes. So at some level, we're yes, this is an imperfect endeavor. We're all trying. I think what we need to bear in mind is the goodwill with which people are engaging with this thing. And that, again, comes back to the issue of intention and, again, to the issue of context.
John,
go ahead.
Point. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we're talking a lot about sort of like historically the purposes of universities and the classrooms and texts and all of that. And I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these things have been developed that have centered whiteness, that have not had me in mind historically. And so even when we talk about historical texts, that's why it's important to bring in diverse authors, Black and Brown authors, so that even when we think about history, the lens that we're viewing it through is a diverse one, right? So like this idea of going back to like what was the purpose of classrooms and the academy is a place that is steeped in racism and has policies, procedures, and practices that are also not inclusive. So how much are we really given this sort of like, let's go back to what this was meant to be, and how much do we sort of just need to dismantle that and think about creating new ways moving forward? So I'm just putting that out there as my perspective and opinion.
I mean, how do you dismantle that? How do you change it? Because, within the frameworks of existing power dimensions, I am familiar with some efforts by students to insist that kind of whole core curricula be revised and other things. And I know, John, I'm sure you followed some of these things, though they aren't as recent right now. But Neijma, I mean, how do you think that can happen? What is your ideal of how that comes about?
I think one thing is something that I just mentioned, and it starts in the classroom. The text and the material that we're introducing to our students, oftentimes it's not diverse. It's based on white authors. It might be based on men. I mean, I'm in social work which is somewhat of a more diverse profession, but even the text that we use, it's not as diverse as it needs to be. So bringing in different perspectives on some of the historical things that we've been talking about, bringing in more diverse authors into the classroom so that we're getting all of those perspectives, because we're coming in and we're teaching texts and we're teaching things again that oftentimes didn't have people like me in mind, and that's one way to begin to dismantle it in the classroom, something very simple.
Amna.
So I'd like to come in there. I agree that we need a diversity of perspectives even when dealing with history. And actually find, if you look at our curricula, so many professors have made that move already. We do not teach a history that is a white man's history anymore. We do not teach, at least in my classes or in a lot of professors' classes, but also I want to take issue with the fact that, when I'm teaching colonialism, I have to deal, when I'm talking about colonial policies, I have to engage with, let's say, the official documents of the colonial state to show the inequities that are inherent in there, right? And that were in the framework over there. So I'm actually using them to show precisely how people were silenced, but I can't do that without looking at some of those texts. Having said that, a lot of my classes, for instance, will include subaltern voices, the voices of the people who were being affected by those policies when available. But in many historical contexts, those voices are not available by virtue of the fact that they weren't written. Of course, this is very, very contingent on what period you're studying and whose voices were documented. But when you go back to medieval period, you don't have the peasant writing, and we can't engage with that. We can come at it with different perspectives or try and access those ideas through different perspectives, but we have to engage with the texts that we have at our disposal for particular periods. And the second thing I'd say is to think that we all, of course, I grew up reading, European literature, Pakistani literature, and French literature. It was a delight to be able to extend myself beyond who I am and have the ability to imagine, which I think is at the heart of an education as well, is to be able to transcend yourself and see things from different perspectives. And that is allowed to you when you are engaging with all kinds of materials, diverse voices indeed, but not necessarily only those voices that are coming from people who look like me or who come from a place like me. I'm all for diversity, but the true heart of diversity, where we're really encouraging people to transcend themselves and think in new and creative ways for a better society.
I want to pause here to invite any questions from the audience. Please feel free to put them in the chat or Q&A boxes if you have them. And I'll ask you, John, this question. We've seen pivoting here from the kind of question about history and diversity and how that is reformed over time. I wanted to come back to the question of investigations. What to you is sufficient grounds for administrative bodies to say, we need to pull this professor from the class and conduct an investigation? And do you think that people have been too, quick to kind of launch into that phase, or not quick enough?
Well, I think in a lot of cases, they've been too quick to go into investigations. And the first thing I would say is that you investigate first, and then you pull the professor from the classroom after you've found some grounds for doing so. So I think there's a really dangerous tendency to suspend professors while you look into something, rather without recognizing that a suspension like that is a form of punishment, that it shouldn't happen unless there's an immediate danger or an actual evidence of wrongdoing. And that to me is the case, that there is a chilling effect that can happen just from having an investigation. And so there should be authority within universities to dismiss cases that clearly don't meet the standard of harassment and all of that. And there also needs to be, as I said, whether it's bias response teams or other ways to address things that professors have done that are imperfect, that are bad, that are harmful, but that don't rise to the level of a punishable offense. And so we need to have ways to address the ways that students may be harmed, and try to get professors to educate them and convince them to change the way they they engage in their practices without using the threat of punishment, without using even the threat of investigation, to have ways of really having a conversation about these issues with professors and with the students who are upset by what's happened.
When it comes to those decisions, I'm also curious to ask you, what is your view of who should be making them and to what extent, to what degree they should be academic governance issues or faculty committee issues versus, administrative bodies?
I do think strongly that these ought to be faculty committees that deal with things. Faculty are the experts on students. They're the experts on teaching. They're the experts on all these kinds of issues within the classroom, not in administrators, really. And so it ought to be certainly the faculty that ought to be the primary ones regulating other faculty. When faculty have committed misconduct, to either speak out against them and criticize them, to try and help them and educate them, or when necessary to punish them and investigate them. And so the faculty ought to be at the core of addressing these kind of problems, because they are the real experts about what is proper within the classroom.
Neijma, any thoughts on this question of investigations and what kind of merits investigation or suspension in a, quick, hot pressure situation?
Can you also hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I am very careful of using the word investigation. I think that there's investigation and I think that there's assessment. And so words matter. And so for me, I have always used the words assessment because we're actually assessing the situation to get a sense of what is happening. I think for me, investigation is heavy and it from the beginning can begin to point fingers, just the fact that you're even doing an investigation. And so I think it's really important, one, to get the input of the person who's been harmed to figure out what is it that you actually want. I think that's a step that we miss and we launch into these investigations. And I've had students who are like, wait a minute, this is not what I want. I really just want a conversation. So I think first being able to sort of pass out whether this should be an investigation or just an assessment to figure out is really important. And so I have often advised universities, when you're doing an investigation, to me, that is your office of conduct, or we're talking about the general counsel's office or something like that. When you're doing sort of an assessment, that is more of a less formal thing. We're just trying to do this sort of like initial. And I have found even using assessment has allowed people to share much more and give a lot more information because they don't necessarily feel like this is an investigation being conducted. So.
Amna, any thoughts on this question?
I agree. If there is a situation where there is a breach of serious norms, there should be consequences. I'm not saying that nobody should be taken to task, but I like Neijma's framing of it. I think so much of how we think about these things recently has become, in this kind of punitive framework where we're thinking about justice and punishment. And so, yes, of course, I wouldn't ever say that if there's a complaint, we should just dismiss it. It is the responsibility of the institution to look into it. And assessment might be a better way to frame it. Yet at the same time, I think, not everything should rise to that level. There is a responsibility as an educational institution to say, well, before even looking into like calling in the professor and doing things, is to like really listen to it and see, does this really have any merit? Is this a complaint that merits more attention? So yeah, assessment, I agree with that.
All right, we had a question here in the audience, and I wanted to put it to you all, which was just kind of returning to the question of different processes, other possibilities, using transformative or restorative justice to resolve these situations. Neijma, John, Amna, do any of you have any thoughts, if you could talk a little bit about what you think that could look like in the case where, a professor has said something, students are upset, and it's been brought to one of your offices, or your office maybe, if you were running one.
So I mentioned restorative justice practices in the beginning, that is what we use. And so what that looks like is, first of all, you have to make sure that your institution is trained on understanding what restorative practices is. On a practical level, you are having conversations with the professor, you're having conversations with the student before you have a meeting to get a sense of sort of what happened. And when you come to that space, the purpose of the space is not to rehash the facts. When you come to this space, there is already an understanding that harm has been caused. And really, that conversation is, how do we move forward beyond this harm? And what do we need to move forward with healing? And so I am really, really big on restorative practices, because I think a lot of people also don't think about it as accountability, but in fact, it is really a level of accountability. And I have had both students and professors who've actually said to me that they would rather have this punitive response, because the punitive response is like one and done. It doesn't really get into the nitty gritties of, let's talk about the harm. And so for me, when you get to that room and that conversations, I have seen nothing but really, really successful results. And what we're also doing is, the professors are also getting an opportunity to receive coaching and information on, okay, this thing happened to me. The next time I go in the classroom, I have some skills and awareness. And they're not sort of afraid to say or share things because they have learned something from being in that restorative session.
Amna, any thoughts on that kind of process? How would react to it? How you think faculty might react to it?
Yeah, I think, this is precisely the kind of process that has that chilling effect on academic freedom and conversations on campus. So I will agree 100% that we need to have spaces where we can talk as a campus or public panels about these kinds of issues. But to think about, again, in a restorative justice framework where we don't even question whether the harm is merited or not, to not hash out the facts, but to really attend to the harm or the feelings of the person, is really not what an educational institution is about, I would argue. We teach responsibly, we don't actively try to harm people, but this is precisely the kind of thing that subtly will insidiously start changing what people feel that they can say in their classrooms or not. So if in this context, it's like, oh, next time I shouldn't say this, because frankly, sitting through these struggle sessions is a commitment and it's long. And most professors, you will find in their accounts, have stopped teaching difficult material precisely because they don't want to be in a position to be doing these things. And as a result, what we're having is very good, interesting, controversial material that should be engaged with, that will help our students be equipped to really be responsible and critical citizens, is missing.
Neijma, any response? And then John will come to you next.
I mean, I can't really relate to that because we've had nothing but success with our restorative practices. Our professors really, really love it, even those that come in a little bit resistant. And as I said before, as a trauma clinician, I don't really get to define people's harm for them. And so I really don't operate from the perspective of whether harm is warranted or not. Your experience is your experience.
I do just want to bring attention to a comment here in the Q&A at the bottom from Professor Jennifer Ho, who is just cautioning that perhaps maybe there are different definitions of restorative justice that we're discussing here. In her view, Amna, she says what you're describing is not what those processes promote or what they're about. So maybe there's some question for a future panel for us to take up here around what those processes do or don't. It is interesting to consider, the role of mediation, if we wanted to just use a different word for it, and how it could, I think, impact these processes. John, I'm going to give the last word to you here. When you think about these processes and how they can be better handled, what sticks out in your mind as a best practice or your advice?
Well, I think there's always a danger that there can be a chilling effect from dealing with criticism, whether it's in a process of restorative justice or through public criticism and denunciations. But ultimately, the university is about engaging in criticism and engaging in debate. And as long as we're avoiding, I think, the process of formal punishments of people for their speech, that kind of criticism has to be wide open. Students have to be free to criticize their professors, and students have to sometimes deal with that criticism or things they don't like from their professors. So I think ultimately that kind of wide open opportunity for debate is what a university has to be all about. And we have to be unafraid to deal with the fact that there's going to be conflict and denunciations and cancel culture and all of this kind of criticism that's out there. I think universities just have to protect the formal processes of allowing that debate to happen, for people not to be punished for engaging in free speech. And when that happens, we have to deal with the danger of self-censorship from criticism as another problem among many that we have to deal with in our culture, and understand that you don't have the right to be free from criticism. And universities are all about creating an atmosphere where there is criticism that goes on.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John, Amna, Neijma, for being with us today. We didn't resolve all of our disagreements about these issues, but I do think it was a fruitful and informative conversation about some of these challenges and the challenges and how they're resolved when new incidents arise on college campuses. Thank you all to our audience also for tuning into this episode of The Common Room. Our program will return in a few weeks for further conversation. We'll see you then.